I'm going to go across to Chris now, if that's all right. So Chris, hello, good evening. So this is Chris Herring, and Chris is director of the Green Building Store in Golka in Huddersfield. So it's very much a fabulous local resource. And also, Chris is one of the UK's leading experts in high performance window design, but also very, very significantly, Chris is the current chair of the Passivhaus Trust. So across to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I have to say, Mike, that I really enjoyed the presentation without PowerPoint. And I say that because I'm going to drown you in PowerPoint. So I'm afraid. So I'll just share my screen, if I may, and see if that slideshow, my computer will. Are we there?
We are indeed, Chris,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, right. So I'm going to build really on particularly what Mike said and talk about Passivhaus. And I've just called this making buildings more sustainable because I see Passivhaus as having a key role in making buildings more sustainable. This slide is the thin blue line. This is where we live. This is our home in a very dark universe. So, and clearly we are messing it up at the moment. So we need to address that. So just to say, to further the introduction, really, Green Building Store is based just outside Huddersfield at Balstamore, anybody who's local. We sell, we provide consultancy, we sell products to promote energy efficient buildings. We pioneered Passivhaus in the UK. This is the Denbigh Passivhaus, which is, as you might think, it's Denbigh. It's one of the first passive houses in the UK, built in the UK in 2010. And since then, we've done several more passive houses. We've done quite a lot of retrofits. An interesting talk about retrofit we might come back to. But the main core of the business is actually selling products and knowledge. I am also, as Chris has said, chair of the Passivhaus Trust in the UK. I helped found it in 2010. And of course, Passivhaus has really taken off in the last 10, 11 years. You can see the takeoff to 2020 here, and still growing very fast and having a real influence on the construction industry, which I shall come back to. And just a reminder, of course, of where we are. So this is, we know that, you know, this decade is the critical decade probably for humanity for the next however many years, you know, a long time. This is the critical moment for us. Or as Greta Thunberg says, our house is on fire. So, and I would say that there is no such thing as sustainable building. We need to make all buildings sustainable. That's our responsibility now. It's a time of crisis. And certainly when we're doing new build, that's what we should be taking into account. And a reminder that, you know, there is an awful lot to talk about powering up, how we get our power, where we take it from, renewables, etc. But to go alongside that, we need to power down. We must reduce our energy use so that we can then bring it from sustainable sources. And to do that, of course, we need to, as the slide shows here, we need to take the low-hanging fruit first. And one of the places where there are low-hanging fruit is currently in new build. So this is just by way of introduction, really. The house, the blue house on the left is thermographic image, and obviously the colder the color, the colder the building. That means it's not leaking heat. And the house in the center there on the left is actually in the street in Hereford. It's the first passive house retrofit in the UK. And you can see that it's losing very little heat. The house on the right I grabbed off Google, but basically it probably could be any new build, most new builds in the UK, and a lot of other sort of existing housing stock leaking lots of heat. And that's the story we're looking at really with Passivhaus. So this is what we build to at the moment, Part L, the building regulations, and we have to bear in mind that this is a minimum standard. This is the legal minimum. We can't build worse than this. It's the worst possible standard we can build to. But if we're going to move beyond building regulations, and as individuals, we often want to do that, and Mike's given a very good example of the work he's done, but also as a country, we need to move beyond current building regulations. We need some signposts with something on them. And this is where Passivhaus really comes in. Passivhaus is about energy efficiency. This is Dr. Feist, who with a group of colleagues have developed the concept. We'll see a little bit more in a minute. And it's all about minimizing the heat needed to make us comfortable in the building. But the other sides of Passive House, of course, are comfort and a very healthy indoor environment. Now, you can build on that further with something like the Well Standard, and the Well Standard goes very well with Passive House. That's certainly, people have experimented with that as well. But fundamentally, if you build to Passive House standard, you will get a much better indoor environment than you will with a conventionally built house at the moment. And the important thing to bear in mind is the performance gap. Now, Dr. Feist, when he was looking at this, was looking at the efforts to increase the performance of buildings in the 70s and 80s, and people were doing that and not actually getting the reduction in energy that they expected. And that gap between what you think you're going to get and what you do get is called the performance gap. And Dr. Feist set out to find out why he built these experimental houses in the early 90s, and out of that has grown the Passive House standard. But this story is, if my slides will move on, is replicated across the UK and in fact across the world in many ways. So this is work done locally by Leeds Beckett University, the Centre for the Built Environment, and they've monitored a number of buildings. So they do co-heating tests, which is a physical test of the building. They're not relying on occupant usage. They actually physically warm the building up and measure the heat loss. And the blue columns for each building show what was predicted, and the red columns show what was measured. And you can see there is a big gap in performance generally. And the Passive House Trust has done some work. There's not a lot of data on this, but using what data there is. And on average, we think that the average performance gap is around 2/3. So we're designing 60% worse than what we think we're designing. Interestingly here, the small sample of Passive House dwellings had very, very low predicted energy use, and there was very little performance gap. And that result on Passive Houses has been replicated again and again in the last 20 more years of Passive Houses around the world. So what is it? Well, it's fundamentally what we build now is in effect active. We allow heat to leak out of our buildings, and then we put heat in to make us comfortable. With a Passive House, we reduce that heat loss as far as we can, as far as sensible, and make ourselves comfortable by not losing heat, and then putting a tiny amount in just to top up. And these are the things we need to do. Mike's already talked about all of this really, but continuous insulation, and quite a lot of it, rather a lot more than we use in the current building regulations. We need to particularly eliminate thermal bridges, places which we often ignore at the moment. We're not really driven to do that rigorously, but in Passive House you are, so those have a real effect on the performance of the building. High levels of airtightness, and Mike certainly talked about that, and we need buildings that are sealed. There is no point insulating if you don't make a building airtight as well. Typically Passive House is about 30 times more airtight than current building regulations. We will use triple glazed windows in this climate. They will give us the optimum performance. And then, sorry, I've jumped too fast there. There we are. And we will need a mechanical ventilation system that recovers the heat from our outgoing air, but also ensures that we get optimal ventilation. And that means we get much better comfort and much better air quality. People worry that sealed buildings are unhealthy or feel unhealthy. Most people go into a Passive House and say, oh, it feels fresh. It's a nice feel to it. We do need to think about orientations. Mike mentioned we're not rigorously bound to face south, but we need to model it and make sure of the full performance of the building. If you have all north-facing glazing, the building will not perform as well. And we need to think about the form factor, the surface area in relation to the floor area, because that is the bigger the surface area, the more heat loss. So that we're driven to do that. We need something that accurately models what the building does so that we know what we're building. I regularly get people saying, I want to super insulate, I want to do this and that. And I say to them, do you know what you're getting for spending this extra money? Do you actually know how your building is going to perform? And they don't. The Passive House planning package is a very efficient design and verification tool. And finally, what Passive House gives us is a quality assurance system. Now, we don't really quality assure our buildings. We quality assure nearly everything we have made, but we'll buy a house that is barely quality assured, that has a minimal checking, if you like. And, you know, tragically, that's what Grenfell was partly about. So Passive House gives us a really high level of quality assurance. There are some myths about Passive House, particularly that it's all about houses. And certainly there are lots of individual houses around the UK, but there are also larger developments like Goldsmith Street, which won the Sterling Prize a couple of years ago. This one here in Norwich, 100 odd units, or this project here in Camden, it's going to be 400 units eventually, all to Passivhaus standard. York is just developing a 600 unit residential unit development. But it's also about larger buildings. So the Leicester University Medical School, I think, is still the largest passive house in the UK at the moment. And Exeter is developing transport interchange and leisure centre to the passive house standard. That's being construction by Kia at the moment. So what you get building a passive house, you get a comfortable building, you get a healthy building, and you get obviously energy efficiency, lower CO2 emissions, lower bills. So that's the package you get from it. And this is what we think we get. So again, this is estimated work done by the Passivhaus Trust, looking at regulated energy. That's the energy covered by the building regulations. And our calculations show that passive house will on average be about 55% lower in theory. But remember the performance gap. So that was theory. What do we think in practice? If you take the average performance gap, we think it's around 60%, then a passive house will be about basically 75% lower than the average new build in the UK. The Committee on Climate Change agrees with us effectively. In looking at how new homes should perform by 2025, they said space heat demand 15 to 20 kilowatt hours per metre squared per annum. That is the passive house standard. That basically that metric comes from the passive house standard. And obviously we're looking at future home standard in 2025. Net zero carbon is the metric we're working with. And we don't know where that's going at the moment. But what we do know is, again, some work the Passivhaus Trust has done, and that's downloadable from our website. The most efficient way of getting to net zero carbon in a building is to build passive house standard fabric and then add on some renewables. That's the most efficient way of getting there. Now, it isn't all about operational energy, of course. So what about embodied carbon, embodied energy? Well, the important thing here is this, there are different figures for this. This is work done by the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI. They looked at typical new build over the lifetime of the building. Around, well, 67% in this case, they're saying, is operational energy. And 21% was embodied energy. So the obvious thing, the low-hanging fruit, is to get that operational energy down first. Passive house is a very good methodology to get there and probably most effective. Once we've done that, we should be thinking about embodied energy as well, of course. And if we want to do that, Passive House actually has a very nice tool recently developed which models the operational and embodied energy through the lifetime of the building. And you can put in your building once you've used your Passive House planning package and model it through and see what that total performance is. But of course, there's even wider impact we have to think about, the ecological impact. However we look at it, cradle to cradle or EPDs, whatever, but we need to look at that. It's very important. And many Passive House designers are working with those ideas as well. Passive House doesn't cover that. It covers the operational energy, but it's also very important, and I would never deny that we need to be looking at that and thinking about the materials we use. And it is a lot, as Mike said, about we building houses too big. We need efficiency. We also need sufficiency. What do we actually need? And sometimes we can minimize our use of materials, and that will help, like the Mike's sheet wool, for instance. This is the work of the Passive House Trust. Basically, our plan at the moment is to ensure that Passive House remains a beacon for the industry, what can really be achieved, where we should be going. We want to make sure that that is done properly, so we will continue to promote and support that and control it in a sense. So, well, maybe 1% of the market, it's not 1% at the moment, but we want that knowledge to spread out into the industry. So our plan or our ambition is to train the industry, as many people as we can within the industry. We've put 10% as the aim in the next 10 years, so that knowledge is spreading out. And we've got people with real expertise going out into the industry. And then we want to influence the whole of the industry. And we are already doing that. When people talk about Passivhaus, it really does act as a beacon. So we want to influence the lot. And actually, interestingly, our head of policy and research has just been poached by MHCLG for a senior civil service post. So we have somebody with really real building physics knowledge within MHCLG, and which is quite unusual, because in my experience, most people there actually got economics degrees or whatever, PP, whatever it is. So I think that's really important, that influence. So that's me. I think I'm just over 10 minutes, Chris, and sorry for that. Thank you for listening, and very happy to answer questions as we move forward.
Fantastic. Well, what a wonderful introduction to the principle of the Passivhaus there, Chris. So thank you very much indeed for that, and a real sort of whistle-stop tour.
I don't think I've ever done it so fast, Chris, to be honest.
I appreciated that. I think all our speakers probably have much more to say, and certainly I know that you were virtually bubbling with enthusiasm there, Chris, for that as well. So I've got a couple of questions and a couple of points in here as well. I think the first point I want to sort of make is perhaps to take Rob up on his invitation of people sort of whizzing across to Liverpool to have a look at the spine and what you're doing there. And Gideon Richards from one of our Sustainable Huddersfield gentlemen is saying it'd be great to organise a trip. So I don't know, how do we get in touch, Rob, and how do we decide to sort of become?
Yeah, sure. If you coordinate from the Sustainable Huddersfield side, Chris, I can organise that with the college. I've got the gold key to get us into the building.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got the code for the building or the right fingerprint, then
that's right. And we, jump on the train. It's not even an hour to Liverpool on the fast train from Huddersfield.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great open invitation. So thanks once again, Rob.
Could I just add into that? Sorry. I think it's always inspiring to see buildings. You really do learn a lot, and I certainly encourage people to go and see a well building like that one. It's the same thing with Passivhaus. The best, in fact, something Wolfgang Weiss said to me a long time ago was, the most important thing is to get the buildings built as the exemplars and get people to see them. The Passivhaus movement across the world opens up buildings in November. So we try and have open days. Obviously, last year they were all virtual, sadly, but the previous 10 years we've run Green Building Store. We've run open days in early November around a number of our Passivhaus projects. So if you are interested in visiting, talking to people who live in passive houses or seeing what can be done, look out for that wherever you live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that, Chris. And that's a very, very sort of good pointer there. I'm just looking down the chat here. I've got a question which I think is to everybody, in fact, from Mark Horsfall. So question to all presenters: how do you change the industry from a novelty use of sustainable building techniques, Passivhaus, well standard and so on, to mass utilisation? And I'm just sort of wondering, sort of, you were looking right back in the 1970s, Mike, about sort of your views on energy consumption and how that operated, and you've seen the techniques that were utilised in Norway and so on. How do we sort of get to moving the industry forward, would you feel?
Well, actually, there's a bit of a negative I want to throw into this, if you don't mind, and it's got to do with heat pumps. And it embodies a lot of the projects that various governments get involved in, and trying to get everybody modernised and or energy efficient. On the last project that we worked with, we decided that we were going to put in an air source heat pump, and we went out to various suppliers to say how much would this cost, and the cost